All right, last parts of the brain here and their functions. We're just going to kind of hit some highlights on what's going on in your brain stem and your cerebellum. So as you guys are learning over on the anatomy side, the brain stem, now that's going to be it's in the medial part of the brain, inferior part of the brain, and that is the area that connects to the spinal cord. And it's divided up into three major regions. The midbrain, or the mesencephalon, is another name for that, and the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So similar, it looks very much like just an upper part of the spinal cord, but it is actually considered to be a brain structure, and there are many nuclei in there, clusters of neuron cell bodies that are scattered around throughout the brainstem. Brainstem also contains a lot of nerve fibers, ascending and descending nerve fibers that are extending, of course, from the spinal cord up to the brain. If you're going to get to the main part of the brain, then you got to pass from the spinal cord, you got to pass through the brainstem, so that makes sense. Lots of automatic type behaviors are controlled within the brain stem, such as your breathing and your cardiac control centers. You're going to learn a lot more about those when you take Biology 202. And also, we'll have a video lecture. Well, over in the lab side, you're taking the anatomy side, you're taking a look at the cranial nerves, your 12 pairs of cranial nerves that you have. 10 of those actually extend off of the brainstem rather than the cerebrum. All right, so up in here, this diagram from your textbook, we are looking at the brainstem in a side view. So up here in purple, this is the thalamus, so that's the largest portion of your diencephalon, but then everything you see down in here makes up parts of your brainstem. So this upper area up in here is the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. Then we have the pons over in here. And then down in here you have the medulla oblongata. And here's your hypothalamus over in here, and then there's your pituitary gland. So you can kind of see how these things are related to each other. And then they're also showing you there in yellow, those are cranial nerves that are extending off of the brainstem, and then of course they're sliced off so you can't see how far outward they're extending. Okay, the cerebellum kind of looks like a little mini brain, and it actually makes up about 11% of the brain mass. So it's dorsal to the pons and the medulla oblongata, so it's behind those structures. Then it's inferior to the cerebrum. It sits underneath the occipital lobe of the brain. That's kind of an interesting area of the brain as well, because it's involved in coordinating skeletal muscle movements. So like when you learn how to ride a bike, you don't really have to think about it that much anymore. The cerebellum plays a role. You have neurons there. You have gray matter and you have white matter within the cerebellum itself. And the neurons that are located in there, one of the main things that they do is they help plan those types of coordinated movements. Okay, so here is the cerebellum cut open. We're looking at it in a sagittal section. And over on the anatomy side, you're learning about how you do have gray matter areas and white matter areas within the cerebellum. And the white matter areas, when you cut one of these open, it actually does look like a tree. So it's called the arbor vitae. That means tree of life. Kind of widest structures that you see there. And it really does look like that if you cut open a real one. Then over here on the brainstem, here's the pons, and down here's the medulla oblongata. So that's just kind of giving you an overview of where those things are located. Another term you should be at least a little bit familiar with, especially if you're going into the physical therapy assistantship program or something similar. This cerebellum receives signals from your proprioceptors. Those are sensory structures, nervous tissue structures that are part of your sensory nervous system that react to changes in joints. You know, like if your foot wobbled over to the right or to the left, that type of information is sent upward to the brain, and the cerebellum deals with some of those signals, and that helps inform your cerebrum up in here about your position, your body position. Are you standing upright? Are you leaning one way or are you leaning the other? So as I mentioned, the cerebellar cortex, so that's the gray areas of the cerebellum, help calculate the best way for you to smoothly coordinate a muscle contraction. That's one of the main functions of the cerebellum. You think about it, you're doing something like running or ice skating or riding a bike, lifting something that's heavy. That involves lots of muscles, and you execute those movements very smoothly. And so all that coordination, there's a lot of very precise coordination and control that has to take place from those neurons in your primary motor cortex up in here. They've got to send signals downward to stimulate your lower motor neurons and tell the correct ones to stimulate the correct muscle fibers. So all that takes a lot of planning and very smooth, coordinated calculation. So the cerebellum makes those calculations, kind of sends a blueprint of coordinated movement up to your cerebral motor cortex up here, and then you have these upper motor neurons up here that then send action potentials downward to the lower motor neurons that are the right ones that need to be stimulated. Because you got to stimulate the right muscle fibers, you have to have the correct force of stimulation as well. That's important also. So lots of complaints. It's amazing how all of that actually winds up working. The cerebellum also has some cognitive functions as well, awareness type functions, understanding type functions. And so as we've already mentioned, it's going to help predict the sequence events during complex movements. It also plays roles in things like word association games, when you can associate different words together, solving puzzles. Apparently the cerebellum is critical for that. And again, those types of things a lot of times have been worked out because there are people who have cerebellum injuries or disorders or whatever, and then they lose some of those functions. So that's how some of those different things have been mapped within the brain. All right, so that concludes our overview of brain function. And again, use your study guide that I've provided you to kind of walk you through what you need to know. There is quite a bit of memory work with the nervous system. So you want to try to make that as efficient as possible by using your study guide outline that I've given you. The next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more. You're hearing some of this over on the anatomy side, but we'll talk a little bit more about the protection of the brain and the spinal cord on the next video lecture.